The Oracle Network. Look deeper.
We have an active shooter. We have an active shooter inside the warehouse.
Welcome to Active Shooter, a podcast that covers the whys, the hows, and the aftermath of active shooter and mass casualty events.
They have an active shooter in the building. A second call says they are being attacked.
I've been shot. 1692 means we got shots fired. 4:15 at Route 291. Sounded like an automatic firearm.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter
mass casualty incidents.
Thank you for listening.
You are listening to Active Shooter, a podcast that may contain adult themes, explicit language, and graphic depictions of violence. Portions of this show may be traumatic for those under 18. Listener discretion is advised.
Fox Urgent now, a school shooting this morning. Police say 2 high school students are dead in the state of New Mexico. It happened at Aztec High School in the northwestern part of the state, about a 3-hour drive or so north of Albuquerque. Cops now confirm the shooter is also dead. No word yet if the suspect was a student, but though earlier reports suggested about a dozen more people might have been hurt, the police now tell us nobody else was hurt. 2 killed plus the shooter killed. Shortly after the gunfire started, police say they got students and staff out of the building and searched every room. More updates out of New Mexico as they come in.
The goal or objective of the Active Shooter podcast has never been to cast blame on anyone, except the shooter or perpetrator in mass casualty events. We've never sought to point the finger at one group or another for failing society. No. The purpose of discussing these horrible tragedies is to understand why and how it happened, and whether it could have been prevented, and how we can take measures to stop or mitigate future shootings. The shooter we cover in today's episode, however, most certainly could have been stopped. Only a year before carrying out his truly senseless act, the FBI investigated him because he was posting online that he was looking for a gun to purchase, so he could carry out a shooting. There was a myriad of evidence and reason to at least continue to follow up with this young man. Anything to ensure that he did not, in fact, inflict the pain and suffering he seemed intent on. Yes, this shooting is most certainly one of the most preventable that we have covered, and while a significant time will not be spent on this message, we will cover some of the failures in greater depth later in the show. On December 7th, 2017, the world would completely shatter for so many young, innocent students at the Aztec High School. Students that probably felt somewhat protected in the bubble of their relatively small town, and even smaller high school. Innocence was lost that day, in the most profound of ways. Most adults cannot begin to know how to process the emotions of a highly traumatic event. And these were just teenagers, young people who became adults, dealing with adult emotions in an instant. Active Shooter the podcast is a High Five Holly production, and I'm your host, JT. If you've listened to our prior episodes, you know that the Active Shooter podcast team has taken the No Notoriety pledge, and we will not be sharing the real name of the shooters that we cover. We will be giving the shooters a pseudonym and refer to them by that name throughout the episode. This will help in clearing up any confusion in the story, while remaining true to our pledge and not naming the shooter by their actual name. We will refer to today's shooter as Mike. Aztec, New Mexico is quite cold in the wintertime, despite what most people would think. Situated within San Juan County, Aztec is located in the northwest corner of New Mexico, surrounded by indigenous land and mountains. December 7th, 2017 wasn't different from most other winter days in the small town, as the sun rose to greet the bitterly cold morning. Around 8 o'clock a.m. that morning, surveillance footage showed Mike walking along Yemez Street towards the school, located at 500 East Checa Street. He entered the 800-900 building of the school, which houses the computer labs and some other classrooms that were available for general use. Mike headed towards the bathroom that was on the second floor. His intention: prepare his gun, a 9mm Glock 19 Gen 4, and suit up, as if he was headed into combat. At the precise moment that Mike exited the bathroom, Casey Marquez had been walking down the hallway when she stopped at the drinking fountain for a quick sip of water. The drinking fountain was just outside of the restrooms, thereby exposing Casey to the creator of her death. Mike raised his gun, shot, and killed Casey. Janitor Emery Hill and teacher Steve Lanier had the grave misfortune of witnessing this shocking act of violence. He fired multiple bullets at this unsuspecting victim. 2 shots were right to Casey's head, which caused hemorrhaging on her brain and numerous fractures to her skull and facial bones. Another bullet ripped through her chest and impacted her heart and lungs that caused massive internal bleeding. Casey also suffered wounds in the abdomen and thigh. After witnessing this atrocious act, the janitor Emery radioed to the main office to alert them of an active shooter and to call 911 right away. That 911 call was placed at 8:11 a.m., and the police arrived quickly, only 3 minutes later. The intercom also blasted out instructions to go into lockdown mode.
Please pardon the interruption. At this time, we are going to ask that students and staff proceed to conduct an internal lockdown. I repeat, this is not a drill. Please proceed to internal lockdown. 911 has been called. Remain in internal lockdown until instructed otherwise by a uniformed officer.
Meanwhile, Mike was on his way to cause more destruction. He attempted to enter several other classrooms because his ultimate goal was to hold an entire classroom hostage. As Mike stalked the hallways, another student, Paco, had left his classroom heading to the bathrooms. Just outside of Mr. Thiel's classroom, Paco saw Mike coming, and rather than go inside the toilet, he turned and ran away, sustaining multiple shots to the back as he fled for his life.
I was walking in late, 5 minutes late, and I walked upstairs past the bathroom that shooter was in, and then I walked past Paco.
Bullets perforated both of his lungs and heart and nicked a kidney. There were a total of 7 shots through Paco's back and 2 in the head. Additionally, Paco was shot through his left elbow and forearm and right forearm and wrist, and finally, he had 2 graze wounds on the left side of his neck. The innocent young man suffered a total of 27 different injuries. While the kill shot was probably from the head, chest, or abdomen, the medical examiner had difficulty distinguishing which shot was the one that ultimately killed Paco. Hearing so many gunshots, teachers were busy in their lockdown classrooms, ordering students to barricade the doors and use textbooks as a shield against their chests to protect themselves.
Next thing we knew, our teachers are yelling for us to get in the closet right now, and that it was gunshots.
The fire alarm had been pulled, and the cacophony of blaring alarms, gunshots, and Mike screaming and yelling through the hallways are sounds that none of those students will likely ever be able to forget or drown out. Mr. Polk's class had just finished reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, and the attendance roll call was wrapping up when both student Andrew Willis and Mr. Polk heard the gun blasting outside of their classroom. Andrew heard between 15 and 20 shots, and even heard Mike reloading his gun. Mr. Polk hurried to the door to lock it after hearing about 6 to 9 popping sounds. He correctly identified as gunshots. After closing the door, he hit the panic button, which directly alerted the front office of the emergency. After the panic button, Mr. Polk utilized the intercom system within the classroom to instruct his students to go into lockdown mode, as he began pushing desks up against the door. These students were also told to use their textbooks as shields against their chests, and to huddle up in the corner, which they did. That, and they probably prayed for their lives.
Turned off all the lights and just waited for it to unfold and whatever was going to happen, and heard more shots. And the sound of those shots I'll never forget. I told my kids, get books, get a book to protect your chest. I've got 20 right here that are not going to die today. Not today.
Madison Frost was in her computer applications class in room number 902 that terrifying morning. Her teacher, Mr. Potter, wasn't in class that day, and there was a substitute teacher in class. 74-year-old Katie Potter was subbing for the unrelated Mr. Potter, and because of this, she didn't have the keys for the classroom, which were needed in order to go on lockdown. Miss Potter asked the students how to lock the door. There was no deadbolt or any other mechanism by which to secure the door shut. That didn't stop Miss Potter. She was a quick thinker and started to usher the students into the classroom office. She closed the door and moved the couch up against the door as a barrier between this unknown shooter and herself and 16 students. Mike entered the classroom and immediately began shooting through the small interior's office walls and door. He was screaming, "I know you're in there." Madison later reported hearing him also hollering, "Is anyone in here?" and telling them all to come out. She was listening to the magazines hitting the floor as Mike shot through the walls, so much that he needed to reload his gun. Twice. It's truly a miracle that not one student in that office, nor Miss Potter, was hit or injured.
I heard popping sounds down the hall, going pop, pop, pop. I looked in the hall, and the custodian, Emery Hill, was in the hall, and he was saying, "Who are you?" And I could tell he was frantic, and I knew what was going on. They knew they were in serious danger, and a few of them said, "I don't want to die." And I go, "You know what? You're going to be okay." I heard pop, pop, pop for probably 4 or 5 minutes, and he was right outside the door, and I knew that he was shooting everything up. I told the secretary who called me this morning, I said, "If you need somebody Monday, I'll be there."
Seth Sheets sat inside Mr. Maxwell's classroom when he thought he heard an angry student yelling in the hallway. He listened to a voice that sounded like Paco yelling, "What the fuck are you doing here?" The scariest part, however, was when Seth heard shell casings hitting the ground and immediately knew it was gunfire outside the classroom. They were locked down, but Mike's voice carried throughout the hallways, screaming over the petrified students that tearfully begged him to stop and asked him why he was doing this. Mike was banging on the classroom's windows as he passed, trying to get inside and carry out even more killings. Mercifully, the windows didn't break.
So everybody was just like praying and crying at the same time and just confused. We hear like a couple more gunshots and it like shoots through our classroom and like the window busts out. As soon as that happened, everybody came to the back, and I was already sitting in the back, like the very back, and I was already underneath my desk.
When Mike heard the sirens approaching, he knew he needed to act fast, so he ran towards the upper-level hallway of the 800-900 building, where there was a catwalk that connected 800-900 to the 400-500 building. He heard police forcing their way inside through gunfire, not to make an already chaotic scene worse, but because all the doors were closed and locked due to lockdown mode. Officers were forced to shoot through the windows to gain entry, but by that time, Mike had already put the gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. He was found by police with a single, self-inflicted gunshot wound that fractured facial bones as it